Welcome to the Fleet Success Show. We are a podcast dedicated to talking about the fundamentals, standards, and best practices that empower today's fleets to achieve fleet success. Let's get into the show.
All right, welcome back for another episode of the Fleet Success Show. I'm your host, Josh Turley, running solo today. And today I wanted to talk about an exercise we just went through with my staff and learn this. I've actually probably done a version of this several times over the last 10 years. But I was at an event called SaaS Academy and heard it in a different way. And I think that's something that's always fun, is when you hear something in a different way and it clicks or it resonates and just kind of lights something within you. And this happened for me this time. We were at this event and they demonstrated basically on reviewing your people and how they are meeting your expectations. And I think a lot of us, I'm not going to say we struggle with it, but sometimes we struggle to put it in words or to quantify it or figure out, how do we measure our people on their performance? How do we balance that against their culture fit? And how do we have those conversations? Like, where do we have those conversations? And so, to kind of set the stage, one of the things that I learned many years ago from Fred Croyne, who I've spoken with in the past, he used to be a very good friend and advisor of mine. And he talked about this concept of like, hey, like you put it on a chart and it helps you identify like your A players, your B players, C players, that kind of thing. People that really belong on the team and people that you're just tolerating. And on one side, he put performance, and on the other side, he put values or culture. And I always kind of liked it, right? But like the challenge I had with it was, how do you rate people that are like, they're doing the job, they're getting the job done? Is that performance a 10 out of 10? Or is it a 5 out of 10? Like, could they be doing better? Where do you put that line, right? So I always struggled with that side. And then on the other side, the values, was it like a 10 out of 10? Like, yes, they have all the values, or they kind of struggle with the values a little bit, or the mission. Where do they fall into all this? And I've done the exercise in the past, and it kind of like, but I think anytime you're doing something and you don't quite believe it, or you don't quite understand it as well as you could, you don't necessarily put your whole heart and record into it yet. And so this last week, as I was listening to Dan Martell, and he was talking about this concept, I was like, okay, yeah, I've heard this before. But then he said something and it totally twisted the diagram in my mind. And it made me recognize how the opportunity that was on the table here. And he said, look, when you set the matrix, when you set this little, it's basically just an XY axis, right? You just kind of draw a right angle on your paper. And on the bottom, you put values. And on the left, going up, you put effectiveness. But then he said the thing that really clicked for me, and he says the values is what he calls like the true believer index, from 0 to like true believer, live, breathe, die, the culture, right? Like, you can't separate them from the company without, without it seeming just like, oh, there's no way he could lose them. It'd be like losing a limb. And that'd be the value side of it, right? It's like true believer. They live, breathe, breathe, and die in the culture. They love it. They soak up the Kool-Aid and they're evangelizing to others. Like that's a 10 in the value index. It says on the other side, the effectiveness is it's not enough just to do the job, right? Or get the job done that you've asked of them. It says, how many of them do work that impresses you or that inspires you? When you see what they've done, you're like, wow, that's amazing. Like that is a 10 out of 10 when you rate them. And for me, it was like, oh, okay, like this is what I've been missing, is like, oh, I almost wonder if my standards were too low. And so I had this matrix and I sat down with my managers. I'm like, look guys, like let's just take everybody in the company and figure out like, where do we feel like they land on this chart? Now, the really critical thing is when you put this into the chart, right? Like right along the fives, so you've got a vertical line at 5 and a horizontal line at the 5. And it divides the chart into 4 quadrants. And down in the lower left, and again, this is something I hadn't seen before, but I thought was just really insightful. Down in the lower left, these are the people that you need to transition out, right? And so I wrote the word leave under that. And it's like 60 days. And if you don't do it within 60 days, guess what? You're a selfish prick. And that's really the essentials of it, which is you're too worried about your own feelings that you're not willing to have a hard conversation with somebody that needs a hard conversation, right? And the hard conversation needs to be, I think you're at the wrong company. You're definitely in the wrong job, right? Because like you don't really feel like you fit in here, and it doesn't really, like your work doesn't inspire me. And if you're not having that conversation with them, you're literally being selfish because you're trying to maintain and preserve your own comfort instead of helping them on their way. And I'll tell you, like if you're listening to this podcast, you subscribe to our ideals, that if you're doing that and you're not having those conversations, then you're not acting congruently with our values, right? And you're not necessarily, a part of this tribe, if I were to say that. So I'd push you is if you have people that they're not true believers in your company and they're not doing work that inspires you, you owe it to them to have that conversation, right? And help them leave and find somewhere that does matter. Right above those guys, you have the people that do work that's super impressive, inspiring even, from the 5 to the 10, but they just don't believe in the company and the mission, right? And those ones are, like we know who they are, and those are your cancer cultures, right? Culture cancers. They're toxic. And so for those ones, you've got to look out, right? You have to look out for them. You have to constantly be on guard, vigilant, make sure that they're not poisoning the culture surreptitiously or anything like that. You just got to be watching and looking out for whatever they're doing in the culture. Hopefully, you're having those conversations and having that conversation and say, look, you're not living up to our core values and you're not tolerating, their bad behavior. And you're snuffing those out and moving them into the lower quadrant and the leave quadrant as quick as possible. Especially if they're, like the further left they are, the faster you have to move on getting them out of the organization, right? The further right they are, if they're getting close to that middle line, there might be hope for them. You might be able to get them to buy into the culture and get them to, just act the right way and get them over the line, so to speak. But if they're not, you've got to move on with them and you've got to get them out of the company because they're going to cause some real damage. Down on the bottom right, we have the quadrant, which is, this is the lift quadrant. And this is the one that you've got people that really believe in the culture. They exemplify the mission. They want to succeed here. But maybe they're just like, their work doesn't inspire you. You're sitting there looking at it and saying, man, you could do so much better. Or, it's just like they're in the wrong role and it, but they don't know it, right? And they just keep grinding and grinding and grinding, but it's like, 16-year-old learning stick the first time, just, grinding the gears on the clutch box, and you're just like, oh, come on. It's like nails on a chalkboard. Those people deserve to be lifted, right? Because they totally buy in, and there's a 3-step process for that. One, for those people, if you're looking at it, you build skill first, right? If there's a skills gap, then you figure out, okay, well, this is work that inspires me and this is where you're at and it's not inspiring. Where's the skill gap? Can we invest in you and get you to a point that your work is inspiring? Maybe you just don't have the skill you need to do that particular part of the job. And I'll start there, and and I've had people I've worked with for years trying to get that skill gap up, and I probably waited way too long, but I'd say 6 months, anywhere from 3 to 6 months to get a skill gap narrowed. As long as you're seeing progress, and you can keep going longer as long as you're seeing progress that you're happy with. But you want to make sure that they're working on that skill gap. If the build skill is not working, right, then you transition to the next piece, which is switch roles. Maybe there's a better seat, right? So build skill is number 1. Number 2 would be better seat. All right, and again, this is for the people in the bottom right quadrant, which is the lift quadrant. And you try to find out, like, is there a better role that fits this person's strengths? And so I'll sit down with this person and list out, like, hey, here's all the things that you're really good at, and here's all the things that need work, right? And this is why, like, you're just not a good fit in this role. But you bring a ton of value to the team, and here's how, right? You just kind of outline all the different things that they're doing really well, and things that you think, if we put you in this role over here, this role actually needs somebody with a lot of the strengths that you're exhibiting. And it's probably a better fit for you. You'll be a lot happier. You'll be a lot less frustrated anyway, trying to be something you're not. And we try to find that better seat for them. Now, there's two things that come into play when you hit the better seat decision. One is they have to be willing to accept that better seat for them, because it might not be a better paying seat. It also might not be a seat that aligns with their own personal career aspirations. And their ego comes in play to this, right? As they may not want to switch to another job. They may see it as a demotion. They may see it as, getting kicked off the bus, or, worse, they might see it as a slap in the face for all the, time that they've put into trying to be what you wanted them to be. And they've got to make that decision, right? I've had some people that, maybe they were in the accounting position and they just didn't belong there and they need to move over here. We've actually had, a couple people within the organization that have switched roles several times because we're trying to find something that really aligns with their skill set. But it has to align with their own vision, their personal vision as well, right? If those first two things can't work, right? They don't want the better seat, or you don't have a better seat available, because that happens too, is we may have a role that they'd be perfect for, but we don't have a spot for them on the bus. Then you transition them to the lower left quadrant and you figure out, how do we help you move on in the next 60 days, right? And maybe that seems harsh, but I am a big believer in not having dead men walking around my organization. And so if there's people that know they're on the way out, or their soul has left the building, their body needs to follow. And the longer you delay that decision and delay the pain, the more painful it gets, right? So quick review, you got the leave, bottom left. You have the lookout, which is the top left. You have the lift, which is the bottom right. And again, those are guys that are true believers, but their work's not impressive. And then the top right, I really like, they phrase this as the golden handcuffs, which is, in my opinion, it's love, right? These are the ones that you want to heap love on, you want to keep, you want to just put all your energy and time into, instead of putting all of your energy and time into the other three quadrants. Because those are the ones that, they buy into the mission, they buy into the vision, the values, but then they also do work that just inspires you. They do impressive work, they own it, whatever your bar is. You look at them and just say, I would want to go to war with this person, right? And the idea is that you put them into these different quadrants and it kind of inspires you to take action. And I think that was another piece that was missing for me, is I've had people show me before, put them on this performance versus values axis. And then, those are your A players, B players, and C players. And it was kind of like, okay, now what? In this model, as Dan was explaining, it was like, oh, well, these ones I need to move on in 60 days. These ones, might not be 60, but I need to be watching out for any of their stuff. And maybe I need to go faster. Maybe I need to go slower, on the top left. And then over here on the top right, or bottom right, I need to really coach and lift and move up. But that top right was like, what are you doing right now to show them the love? Are you making sure their pay is equal? Are you making sure that they're, at the top of their personal market, as Reed Hastings over at Netflix likes to say? Are you making sure they're happy in their job? Are you having skip levels with them? Or whatever you need to do to make sure that they're going to stick around and not surprise you with resignation notice one day. And that's that top right. So we as a management team sat down and did this for the whole company. And then I challenged the managers. I said, look, wherever your people are at on the board, they need to know. And so in the next 2 weeks during your one-on-ones, I want you to have this conversation, the same conversation we had. Have them put themselves on the board and just say, I think I'm probably in about, a 7 here and an 8 here. And then I want you to put them on the board with where you're at. And then you guys get to discuss the gap, right? Why did they think they were an 8 and why did you put them at a 4? Why did they think they were a 7 and you put them at a 9, right? Discuss the gaps in those two numbers and have the honest conversation about where you see them and where you see their future. And so I challenged my management team to do this, right? But then I did another thing, which was maybe to hold them accountable a little bit and make sure they had the conversation, is that I actually walked through this entire module with my staff during our last all hands meeting. And I told them, if your manager's not having the conversation, you go have the conversation with your manager, right? Like, don't wait for your manager to tell you where they see you. You deserve to know at all times how your manager sees you. Go have the conversation, right? Push the envelope, push the buttons, and have that conversation. And the managers are in the room at the time we're doing this all hands meeting. So they're all hearing it, and they know now, I can't hide anymore. I'm not going to, I can't ignore this conversation, because now the people are going to ask, right? And I'm hoping that everybody in the company will have that conversation with their managers, if their manager hasn't had it already, so that they are crystal clear, because that's all anybody really deserves and wants in life is clarity. They want to know where they stand. They want to know how they're moving forward, and that the time and energy that they're putting into this job matters, right? They want to make sure that they're, as we read the 3 signs of a miserable job, they want to make sure that they're not anonymous. They want to make sure that they're, not irrelevant. They want to make sure they can measure their job and that they're doing well. And that honestly, it comes down to that relationship they have with their manager. So if you're in that position that you're managing somebody, have this conversation with them, put them on the box, and then have them put themselves in there, and then have the conversation about the gap. If you're somebody that reports to somebody else, have this conversation, draw up your own box and tell them where you see you, and ask them to rate you on the board, right? How do you see me, boss? How do you see me needing to improve? How do you see me on this scale? And what are you doing if I'm in the top right? How do we make sure that I never leave, right? And that, we've talked about doing, instead of exit interviews, doing keep interviews or stay interviews, where you ask, like, if you were to leave, why would you leave? Have those conversations with your boss. Boss, if I was going to leave, like, this would be what I would leave for. And this would be the reasons why I would leave. And if you're not in a place where you can have that, maybe it's not a safe space, maybe your boss isn't understanding, then I would encourage you to leave, right? Like, there are places out there that can encourage and have a healthy level of, not necessarily conflict, but dialogue would probably be the right way to say that. And you can find a place that treats you like a human being and still gets the job done, right? Like, there are places that do both. And, and I think everybody should have that type of environment, frankly, just because life's too short, right? We spend a third of our lives at work. You don't need to waste a third of your life doing something for somebody that doesn't care about you. So that's going to be our episode for today. Would love to, if you have any other questions, I can send out some resources. Just email us, podcast@rtafleet.com. I'd probably be looking for a blog post on this one too. This was a really fun lesson that we did, especially, as we go through and have some of the fallout from those discussions. You'll see some updates coming on the RTA blog, talking about some of the, implementing some of these things. So until next time, we'll see you on the flip side.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Fleet Success Show. If you like the show, we'd appreciate your 5-star review. Be sure to subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts, and come hang out with us on social media @Fleet Success. See you next time.